As covered in the Midnight's Edge editorial published on October 1st, 2019, Sony had come out far ahead of Disney in their Spider-Man deal, despite the optics that they had at best broken even. As evidenced by the new trailer for Morbius, the new Sony-produced film is deeply embedded in the MCU, featuring not only Michael Keaton popping up in the trailer and J.K. Simmons being listed in the cast, it even featured a cameo of sorts from Spider-Man. As Midnight's Edge has covered, Sony held out for what, in their eyes, was a much better deal, while also smearing Disney through the media. Disney overall is by no means a loser in this deal. However, Sony was able to, for the most part, get everything they wanted and even, in some ways, put the mouse into submission. In this video, we will go over what this means for the MCU and Sony films going forward, how being a part of the MCU will affect Morbius, and what we can expect to see going forward. In a recent roundtable interview with The Hollywood Reporter, Alan Horn of Disney and Tom Rothman of Sony talked about the Spider-Man deal.
The fan base, which is important to all of us, seemed to really respond to what Tom and his folks have done before with our people, and they like it. They like the fact that the MCU and Marvel Cinematic Universe and Kevin Feige were involved, and we heard feedback out there that suggested joining forces once again was probably really a good idea for that part of the world that's most important, which is the fan base.
Do you think this is something that will continue after this next movie?
I hope so.
Because you've shown you can do Spider-Man without Disney on the animated film.
Yes, we have. But I agree with my distinguished colleague from the other side of the aisle that I think this was a classic win-win-win. I think it was a win for Sony. Yeah. I think it was a win for Disney. And I think it was a win for the fans and moviegoers. And the only thing I would say about it is that, you know, news cycles and the rhythm of negotiations do not necessarily overlap.
While they jokingly played it off a bit, there is more to it. Sony got their cake and they ate it too. Morbius and retroactively Venom are in the MCU and will get to bathe in that glory while soaking up all that Marvel cash at the box office. Despite any personal feelings anyone may have for or against the MCU or Sony, this is a huge win for Sony in the sense that the MCU right now is tantamount to having a license to print money. There is nothing at the moment even close to a sure thing in Hollywood as an MCU film. Even the pillars of cinema such as Star Wars and DC crumbled in recent years. With Sony's rocky history at the box office, this was something they were willing to stand on or lose if Disney and Marvel weren't willing to play ball with their demands. Sony were more than willing to take the risk of going it alone without Marvel than having Venom and the other Spider-Verse films hanging in the wind
adjuncts to it,
or clearly not in the same universe as the web slinger. It was also widely noted that Sony had the sole rights to Spider-Man 3 featuring Tom Holland, and as covered in Midnight's Edge previous videos, they were ready to go forward without Kevin Feige and crew despite the drawbacks that they would encounter. The feud got dirty in the press with several leaks and different takes on the situation, which made both sides look greedy and petty. It could be surmised that Feige will take on Star Wars films was a direct jab at Amy Pascal, claiming that Feige was too busy to work on Spider-Man anyway. David had fought Goliath, and much like in that story, and to everybody's surprise, David emerged victorious, especially when it seemed like the fight was over. It seemed like a done deal that both Sony and Disney were moving forward without each other, and there was no chance of the two mending their ways. Even though rumors permeated through social media and were picked up by several outlets, no one could be faulted to think that any hope was folly, unless your name was Tom Holland. In late September of 2019, it seemed that all hope had faded, and Sony and Marvel Studios were ready to go their separate ways. Then on September 27th, there came news that Sony and Marvel were about to reach a deal that would keep Spidey in the MCU for at least one more movie. The deal would also see a Kevin Feige-produced Spider-Man movie released on July 16th, 2021. In addition to Marvel and Sony, there was a third player in the negotiations. On December 5th, 2019, Vanity Fair reported that actor Tom Holland reached out to Disney CEO Bob Iger and urged him not to give up on the deal between the two studios. Holland said when he first heard news of Spider-Man leaving the MCU, "I was devastated. I was very sad to leave the MCU. I personally did not want to go. It was stressful and daunting. I'm just really glad that they were able to work it out." Holland may have had more of an active role in the negotiations than what was first believed. Holland said, I can't disclose what I said in the phone call or what anyone said, but there was lots of conversations that happened between Tom Rothman, myself, Bob Iger, and all these different people. It was out of my hands, but I wanted to say something about the situation and I wanted to thank them for changing my life in the best way. I'm really passionate about playing Spider-Man, and the future of Spider-Man was still very bright in the MCU. It would have been a shame to take him out of the MCU and a huge blow to fans. He belongs there. It was a real honor to be a part of that conversation and process, and I feel pretty good about how things turned out. The outcome was a fantastic one. For Sony, it's important to keep Tom Holland happy. Sony is in a position where it does not have many bankable franchises that they can rely on, having lost the distribution rights to James Bond last year. They also have to bear witness to the success of Sonic the Hedgehog, a film that was at one time supposed to be a Sony property, but was put into turnaround and passed on by Sony CEO Tom Rothman. Tom Holland, who is still contracted to appear as Spider-Man, is also under contract to appear as Nathan Drake in the film version of the popular PlayStation video game series Uncharted. With Holland now a star thanks to the MCU, Uncharted would seem to be on paper a franchise that could be profitable for Sony for the foreseeable future. With the dust finally having settled, Morbius, without missing a beat, is set to hit cinemas on July 31st, 2020. With the new trailer dropping, it was more than clear that Sony was ready to go one way or another, having already started on Morbius before the ink was dry on the deal with Disney. Venom 2 is deep into production, which will more likely have even more references to the MCU, or at the very least, things closely associated with the MCU Spider-Man films. It's most likely the few things that will be connected to the MCU in Morbius will be tangential at best, or were put in after the fact and wouldn't have a big impact on the overall film if the deal went south. As noted in Midnight Edge's previous coverage, many of these films have been in development hell for years and were ready to go if a deal was made or not. For example, a version of the film featuring extensive footage of a character like J. Jonah Jameson could have already existed well before any deal with Disney or even before the MCU. With minor changes to update and match the newer version of the character, that film could still be used. This isn't what necessarily will be the case. However, it's an example of how some things could be retrofitted in this new open world for Sony's films going forward. Despite the new deal opening a lot of new doors for Sony, it may have closed a few others. Most recall the backtracking over an R rating for Venom starring Tom Hardy. Hardy even commented on the other a few times in the press. Despite all the early talk of the film being an R-rated comic book movie, the PG-13 left many to scratch their heads, with the director claiming that the film was always meant to be PG-13. This led many to believe that a deal renewal was on the horizon. At the very least, Sony was hedging their bets and didn't expect the film to play as well as it did, and got cold feet with an R-rated version. This would fit with the Tom Rothman MO. There were also several versions of a story going around that, depending on who was telling it, Kevin Feige or Tom Rothman are responsible for the success of Venom. In the end, what really matters is that a PG-13 rated Venom retroactively fits nicely with the MCU. Despite there being no connection to Spider-Man in the first film, there's a good chance that Spider-Man and Venom will face off at some point in the near future, even if it isn't in Venom 2 or a third Spider-Man film. A third film, which either way Sony still had exclusive rights to. Regardless of Venom's rating, it's obvious that Morbius will shoot for a PG-13, even if it's a hard PG-13. Judging from the first trailer, it will stay in line with the other films. Much like it's easy to believe that the PG-13 rating for Venom had more to do with optics, Sony will think it's barely an inconvenience to make their new Jared Leto vampire comic book movie PG-13. Morbius isn't likely to make Avengers or even Spider-Man money at the box office. However, Sony can bank on the film making upwards of $800 million, judging by other films in the MCU featuring lower-tier characters, and Venom. Morbius has already made sure that everyone knows that this is connected to Spider-Man, even if the mentioned cameo at this point is a poster of the web-slinger, oddly enough from the recent PlayStation 4 video game and in the Sam Raimi costume in the background. Before anyone begins to come up with any multiverse theories, rest assured the inclusion of Michael Keaton and J.K. Simmons confirm more or less that this is connected directly to Spider-Man Homecoming and Far From Home. Both sides see the obvious benefit to having Spider-Man remain in the MCU for as long as possible. Spider-Man Far From Home became the biggest grossing Spider-Man movie for Sony, while cementing Spider-Man's place in the MCU. The rising tide would also lift Sony's other Spider-related properties by being able to connect them back to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In the new deal, Disney gets to make 2 more Spider-Man films and will work with Sony on the spin-off films. There are also plans connected to the animated Spider-Verse. Both sides are indeed interested in extending the deal. As previously reported, Sony has plans spanning out nearly a decade for Spider-Man and all of his amazing friends. This, of course, was revealed in the dark times before the new deal. However, you can bet it was easily set up to adapt to, one way or the other. Let us know what you think about the future of Spider-Man in the MCU, and if you're looking forward to Morbius in the comments.